Hi everyone. I thought that it would be an opportune time to tell you a little bit more about information and knowledge management and the management and preparation of how to look at processes and frameworks to manage information, whether you're running a project or in some instances within the project management office, within a department, etc. And I thought that one of the things that is often not well known about Agile Management Office is the fact that we do provide services that are modular, meaning we can provide support and services in a number of different areas. We've actually got 22 functions that we work within, and information and knowledge management is one of those modules. So whether it's helping to establish a framework for it, establish a set of tools to use, helping teams to learn how to use these tools, whether it's some coaching, facilitating, etc. We can provide different services across different modules. And for today, I wanted to share a little bit about the documents, information and knowledge management module. It's an opportune time now with everything going on in the world where people are remote working and working from home. And one of the things that's been really common is people's abilities to work from home, but actually still having access to their information that they would normally access, whether they're on site with a client or whether they're working remotely from home or whether they're traveling for work, whatever the case might be. Having good systems and structures in place for information and knowledge management within your organization, but also even individually, as the way that you manage your information in your own personal storage facility, whether it's OneDrive or something else, is really important, because being able to retain information, being able to find that information quickly actually helps you to be more efficient, because being able to access information quite quickly has saved me a lot of trouble and got me out of a lot of trouble when I've been called on to find, for example, historical minutes from meetings that took place between a board and external vendors. Being able to find that information quickly and efficiently is really important. So I thought today that I would share with you some practical experience of myself and the team, where we've actually gone through and established some information and knowledge management techniques, specifically some of the activities that we undertook to get to that point. So let's start off by talking about Groupware. So just flip to the next slide. Just a little bit delayed, to apologize about that. So what is Groupware? So Groupware is basically usually termed Groupware, but it's a collaboration software. So it might be a suite of applications, but effectively these applications are there to aid people in completing collaborative tasks. It provides a central repository of information. It enables you to work on things collectively. Really useful when you're remote working, to be able to work on documents at the same time, even though you're not in the same place. Now, most organizations, if not all organizations, no matter how small or large, will have a number of different tools and applications that have been implemented for the purpose of storing information, but actually being able to also work on that information collaboratively. Now, being a small business ourselves, for the last 4 years, we have been very proactive in setting up all of our Groupware so that we can access our information at any time from anywhere in the world. So when this crisis came to the front, it was something that did catch us off guard from the perspective of, unfortunately, not having every single customer set up in the same way. Each of them have their own systems and tools, but internally within our business we did. So when we think about Groupware, one of the things that usually is undertaken as part of our assessments, our capability assessments for clients, is actually undertaken assessment of their existing tools and understanding where those tools are, whether they exist. For example, some clients will often have multiple different tools for different purposes that have no correlation to one another, or someone in one part of the business will purchase a particular tool that helps to provide document sign-offs automatically, for example. And then another person in another area of the business might find another tool that they find is the best for reporting on risks. But then in the project space, they might have another tool for risk management. And so you're finding there's quite a lot of disconnect, and this adds to the gaps that exist between projects and other departments, those that are not in projects. But it can happen across any part of the organization really, but just talking about projects based on sort of where I spend a lot of my time. So one of the things we do when we look at Groupware and doing an assessment for it, as part of the range of activities that we undertake, we also look at what is best practice and best fit for your specific organization. Now that's really important to make sure that we are looking at what works for you. For a recent customer of ours, they were introducing a new HRIS and payroll system. And I can tell you that we looked at 30, 40 plus different solutions in the market. Some that did payroll and HRIS, some that just did one or the other, etc. Regardless of what exactly we are looking at when we're looking at the different tools, the key thing is to make sure that they fit that specific organization, that team, that department, that project. And you can't always do that without undertaking some steps initially to look at how those tools are going to be used, how existing tools in the organization may need to be retired, and how introduction of the new tool will be implemented. For example, I've seen many organizations who have gone through and introduced new tools, and most common one at the moment is Confluence, but provided no training or guidance on how to use it. Now, what will happen with Confluence or any other tool that you don't set up and introduce well is you'll end up having so many variations of how it's used, and you'll have different user access permissions, you'll have different structures, and you'll have so many different ways of it being used that may go against what best practice is for your organization. So it's really important to also think about how is the tool going to be used, and is there any tools in your organization that can be retired? If you're not using the tools, then you don't need to have them there. It adds to the confusion. So that's another thing to consider. When we think about other considerations, well, we need to look at sort of 3 key areas. The core functionality, and that is what does the particular product or service that you are bringing into your organization, what does it look like out of the box? Out of the box meaning you purchase it off the shelf and you start using it tomorrow. A good example of that is the Office 365 suite from Microsoft. That's one that you purchase out of the box and you basically just configure it to suit your organization based on user access permissions and things like that. But when thinking about introducing a new tool or a suite of tools, you need to think about what elements within that suite of tools is going to either automate, streamline, or improve the working life of the people in your team. Because the tool needs to add value and actually also ideally save time, create things, create processes that are efficient, that can be used, become more efficient using those tools rather. What about storage? How is the tool going to be accessed? Is it going to be accessed by a small group of people? Is it a large business? How much storage will you need? Do you need to have real-time accessibility to people co-editing documentation, etc., etc.? The second thing we think about is your people. So your people in your organization and what their needs are. I've seen many instances where organizations have brought about rules that a specific tool needs to be used, and it's happening in pockets rather than enterprise-wide. And it causes confusion because tools are being introduced with no reference to what their teams need or their feedback from their teams on what's wrong with existing tools, and then it just adds layers of confusion. For example, one of the most common tools being used in organizations globally is Microsoft SharePoint. there's probably only been a handful of organizations that I've been to or worked with in the last 16 years that have not used SharePoint. Now, do they all use it correct? No. Do they use it? Yes. Now, the problem is if you don't have a good user experience with a particular tool, you're not going to be likely to use it. And if you are asked to use it, you're probably going to be downloading things offline, working on them separately, and not maintaining historical references to this information and so forth. So there's a lot of different things that we need to take into consideration, and that when talking to your people, understanding from them rather, is what sort of the key features or functionality they would need in a tool. So if I go back to the client I mentioned earlier around payroll and HRIS, well, as part of the project, we will be speaking with the learning management coordinator. We'll be speaking with the payroll director. We'll be speaking with the HR director, speaking with the finance team, actually understanding from them what they need. And if you have to make a call on some parts of the functionality of the particular tool, what parts of that functionality can be left off or paused or delayed for future reference. Also, what are the artifacts, the documentation, the deliverables that underpin that tool? For example, in projects, we might use SharePoint, and we do quite commonly, to make sure that projects are following specific governance structures, and that documentation might be things that can be stored in SharePoint. And so you want to understand how the tool is going to be used and what are the peripheral artifacts that link in with use of that particular tool. And then you think about the business. I talked earlier about making sure that it's the right fit. But in addition to that, think about this. Tools themselves not only require upfront costs usually to bring in the tool, some tools, particularly larger ones, when you're implementing payroll tools or software and whatnot, CRMs, for example, they will require a lot more cost, particularly around licensing and support and whatnot. Purchasing an off-the-shelf type of groupware, such as Office 365, might be is much lower cost, as a lot of that is now in the cloud, and you will access that, and you typically would pay license fees, for example. You might also need some support potentially, and depending on how you want to implement that type of groupware, you may then need a vendor to come in and help you do that. You also need to make sure that you set it up right so you can apply governance required, make sure you've got user access matrix in place, and make sure that you can support it with the growth of your business. I've seen too many times where organizations that are smaller and start growing have not set up the foundations correctly for their information and knowledge management, and what that leads to is confusion down the track and a lot of rework. So don't let that be yourself. Ultimately, when we bring together solutions or recommendations as a result of an assessment, it's not only independent research that we have to undertake, looking at the functionality, looking at how people are going to be using it, whether they're in IT, business, finance, HR, wherever the tool is going to be leveraged, and also how it fits in with your organization. So these are just 3 of the key groupware considerations that we take into place. When we go into the next level down and start thinking about some of the questions that you would want to ask, we would be looking at these sorts of lower level questions. These questions as part of the assessment to undertake our assessment approach is actually looking at some of the more specific things that we need answers to that will help to refine what is the best output for you or for your team or your business, your organization, etc. When we're thinking about, particularly this approach is really for more mid to large organizations. You'll see there's quite a lot of questions that come up underneath this umbrella, but realistically we use the same approach for our small business, and we are a very small business. So what we need to think about is core functionality and what are the things that we want to look at when bringing in a new tool and setting up that new tool. How do you want to allow accessibility? What kind of version history do you want? Sometimes people are unaware that in certain products, for example, Microsoft Teams as another one, there are different settings that you can turn on to actually make it accessible by people outside your organization as well. Now that setting can be set up at the beginning, and it's something that people often don't know about. If you are collaborating within the organization, you might actually want to look at how you put in place a permission matrix or a user access matrix for how accessibility to certain folders and documentation is being done. You also want to think about how you use lists, registers, calendars, and other features within a particular product. Now you can see by looking at some of the questions here that you may notice that a lot of these do relate to Microsoft SharePoint, which is one of the tools that we use and use quite a lot actually. But also there is a number of different other tools in the market, such as Confluence, which is also another one that would take into consideration some of these objectives and requirements. So as I said, we need to think about the questions that you would need to ask. These are some as a guide to help you. If we're looking at the information and knowledge management from a enterprise perspective, and we were thinking about if you were running an EPMO, an enterprise PMO, for example, this is an exact example that we have used for a client of ours in recent times, where you can see that at the time, they didn't have any particular groupware in place that was being leveraged to its full capability. They did have SharePoint, however, and that was something that they desired to continue using. The challenge was they had also other teams, particularly in delivery, that were using Jira and Confluence as well. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with SharePoint and with Confluence, there are a lot of similar features. And there is a lot of features within Confluence that actually enables you to collaborate with your team and other people within your organization. SharePoint is a little bit more structured, but really there is a lot of features in both SharePoint and Confluence that enable knowledge and information sharing. In fact, Confluence works quite like a wiki. It enables teams to add information and create pages and whatnot. You can do the same thing with SharePoint, although maybe not as counterintuitive. I find that Confluence is a little bit more user-friendly because it is a more modern tool, although SharePoint does have other features that I quite like, such as the versioning and accessibility to lists and whatnot. So when we're thinking about an approach for a enterprise, for example, where maybe the EPMO teams are the champions, we think about, okay, what is the information that we would keep and we would need at the enterprise level? So the EPMO is managing that. Things like baseline project documentation, things that you would know that if you were going to get audited, and we do, that you would want to be able to go and access that information and find it in a matter of minutes. If you enable multiple project sites and they're not well maintained, and typically the larger the organization and the more project sites, the harder it is to maintain consistency across the board. But if you were leveraging information from those sites and they were information that was coming up the line from projects into the EPMO, it would make it a little bit more streamlined. That being said, it is a behavioral change and it is something that takes time to set up. Then we think about the project layer. So what are the things that sit under the EPMO's site collection? Site collection being the term for SharePoint, where it has multiple sites that feed into one. Think of it as a parent and then children sites underneath. Well, we can think about having the collaboration space, project delivery items, maybe some key governance artifacts and calendars and whatnot. When we think about the next part of the puzzle, and some organizations actually are using and moving a lot of their SharePoint to Confluence, sometimes that is resulting in positive outcomes. In other instances, not so much. For example, reporting that's usually done in Microsoft PowerPoint has been moving to Confluence for some organizations and actually not being received very well, particularly because the people that are being asked, so the project managers that are being asked to complete the reports in Confluence, have not been shown how to use it. Just because some of these tools are user-friendly and should be pretty straightforward, there's actually a lot of parts of getting used to a new tool. You know, it takes a long time to get your head around a new tool for some people to be able to use it to a point where they understand the ins and outs and how it's going to work. But not only that, as mentioned earlier, sometimes these particular tools have been configured in a certain way to suit the specific organization. And so you need to make sure that information is clarified. Then we think about Jira, and so Jira is another one that was being used, not necessarily for information knowledge management, although it does track information in that regard as well. So obviously it is being referenced. But the reason Jira is featured here is because this particular client was using Jira for a lot of things, in particular, for example, risks and issue management. They were lodging changes and activities that needed to be delivered for the project. They were tracking updates on their sprints and so forth. And so we found that when talking to the team, as you remembered from before, we actually found that they, in the delivery team, were not happy in moving away from Jira and Confluence. So what we needed to do is make sure that we aligned the teams, both the governance teams in the PMO and EPMO, with the delivery teams, and make sure that what we then did is aligned what was going to be provided at the Confluence and Jira versus SharePoint. And that enabled the delivery teams to be happy because they were using the tools that they needed to use. But we were able to extract information such as risks and issue reporting out of Jira into reports that were being collated on SharePoint, for example. Now, this particular team felt that would be the best approach for them to use SharePoint, Jira, and Confluence in parallel, and they did that successfully. Quite well, in fact, because a lot of the people within the project delivery teams that were not at project management level, that were within the projects, actually didn't do anything outside Jira and Confluence. They basically lived in Jira and Confluence during their project time. So this was a particular approach that we took for one of those clients. When we think about information management, it's itself, in terms of the definition being quite straightforward. But information management itself is all about making sure that there is a clear approach, a clear policy, a clear consensus on how information would be created, stored, controlled, retained, and then disposed of. Now, records and information management policies and whatever other terms used in organizations isn't something new. I mean, there is a lot of standards around information knowledge management that exist, and organizations, particularly the bigger you get, the more scrutiny that they come under in making sure that this stuff is correct. So if you're a smaller team or a smaller organization, you have the opportunity to set that foundation early on, but ultimately making sure that you have an appropriate policy in place so that people are aware. For example, when sharing documentation in some banking organizations, for example, or any organization really, but I've seen it quite commonly after spending so much time in banking and finance, that their documentation has their own classifications. Confidential, do not distribute, internal only, etc., etc. So that's something that you would find within a policy, for example. So one of the things that is often a mistake that projects and PMOs do, or maybe they don't do, is they don't often reference existing information and knowledge management policies and then leverage that to then apply it to their projects, programs, and portfolios. I'm not saying all of them don't, some do, but some of them don't. And it's interesting when we undertake assessments that run across the full 22 functions that AMO's method covers, we find that it's one of the big failing areas, where the confusion that occurs as a result of not having structured information and knowledge management is actually one of the biggest challenges. I can't tell you how many times we've found that the root cause of many of the frustrations and problems within a particular team is as a result of people not knowing where things are, not having access to the right information, having the wrong permissions, not having access to log on to a particular site, not knowing how to use a particular tool, and so forth. So it is a real big challenge. And I think that if projects and PMOs had consistency and clarity over that process, they would be more likely to increase their productivity, I would say, because they would have a standard to reference, and that standard hopefully is embedded within your team. So as part of the information management definition and scope for our client, one of the things that we did call out is that there are information management criterion that needs to apply to other things, not just documents, such as risks and issues and project schedules and business requirement documents and so forth. And that is something that needs to be looked at individually. So get the tool right and the foundation set and the structure for that governance, and then start looking at the individual documentation and how you want to treat those documentation, the artifacts associated with them, the templates you're going to use, etc. Again, more consistency, the more productive I think you can be. Some of the specific information management types, these were just some of the ones that applied for our client. Probably very familiar for anyone that's worked in a project before. There's nothing special about this list. It's not rocket science. This particular list is just a guide to show you that when we're thinking about setting up the structure and the phases within the tools, that we made sure that they aligned to this particular I guess framework of information artifacts, and so this was the way that we made sure that the information they felt was important for them was captured. So this is something you would do as part of setting up your tool or system and making sure that that tool or system worked for you. Now, it doesn't matter how small your projects are, whether you're running, $1,000 projects and in a really small business, or whether you're running $100,000 or $1 million project, it doesn't matter. You still can have a particular framework around how the project's being run, and also the documentation that you would need under there. So this is just a little bit of an overview of that. Continued over, this is a little bit more information, but this particular slide references some of the non-project phase specific documentation. You can see that information relating to your people, information relating to knowledge sharing, and information relating to access control. So these are non-project specific. They would apply to a team or a department or a program. You'd even have them, we've got these in our business as well for our own internal purposes. Now, when we look at SharePoint, I've talked about Microsoft SharePoint a lot. I am a big Microsoft user, but I also, and in our business, also use many other tools. In fact, everything we do in our business is agnostic of the tool, so we can work with any software platform, whether you want to use a Microsoft product, Atlassian product, whether you want to use a particular CRM, a particular HRIS system, whether you're using a particular conferencing facility, whatever it is, we flex around your needs because it needs to fit for you. For this particular client, we made sure that the use of SharePoint that they had within their organization that they were already paying for, they already had on site, and was also identified as part of their Office 365 solution. It was something that we leveraged to make sure that they were using what they were paying for. You've got Office 365 and you had SharePoint, you might as well use it. So we made sure that we took into consideration many different things, including how they would manage the sites and the applications, because Office 365 has a lot of apps that you can download. The branding, navigation, template administration, how all of that was going to look and feel, and then all of the extra features that can be introduced as well. We looked at things as low level as metadata requirements, permissions, etc. And so there's a lot of different apps you can get to link in with different products, and it applies across the board. If you are using SharePoint and you also have Office 365, well, you have some really, really big opportunity to absolutely make something wonderful, because I can tell you firsthand, we have both those within our business. We also use Confluence a lot of the time, and with leveraging them in the right way for our business, we've been able to run projects that are as small as one-person team projects right through 100+ team-person projects for our clients. So we leverage these particular products as part of our solution as well. This is just a little bit of a visual of what a blueprint could look like, as it's not too dissimilar to one of the earlier slides. But what I wanted to demonstrate here is you'll see that on the bottom there is a project program site applications or elements that you would set up as apps, and then on the ePMO website, as for SharePoint site, you would maybe add the other items. So you'll see that on an enterprise level PMO, or if that was the top level of your company, you would put things on there like a knowledge base, a leave register, discussion boards and whatnot. You wouldn't necessarily need those in each individual project, but you could have them. It really just depends. For this particular client, we made sure we segregated out what they needed at the project level, and we then created templates for them in SharePoint so that they could pick up that particular template and then reuse that over and over again. And so we would have new projects starting, and then within not even an hour, they would have a brand new SharePoint site ready to go. No more project managers spending hours and hours and hours trying to get it set up and trying to work out permissions and trying to learn about the organization as well. We simplified that process, and I really don't think it was more than 30 minutes to get set up. You'll see there is something in between the ePMO layer and then the project layer. And you can see there's a box with the word called framework. Now, we at Agile Management Office are big believers that if you have a up-to-date, well thought out, well written, clearly articulated framework for your business or your project or your department, depending on what size you are, a framework can do some amazing things, because it gives everybody the opportunity to be on the same page. When we do our P3M3 assessments, which is a global assessment used quite heavily in government actually, it always asks for 5 levels of maturity. First one is awareness, and then number 2 is repeatability, and then number 3 is well defined, and it goes up to 5. Having a framework means once everybody is aware of it, is on the same page, and it defines clearly the processes that everybody will be following, and the processes are repeatable, you're on your way to getting to a level 3. Now, many organizations don't move past level 3, but just to start you off, you just want to get awareness across a number of different processes, whether it's project level, program level, or portfolio level. And one of the things we've done at Agile Management Office is we've taken that approach to assessments and incorporated Agile and the PMO governance space as well, to provide a holistic, end-to-end, big picture. So frameworks are absolutely really important. What does the detail underneath that blueprint look like? Well, here's an example of what the specific underlying information is at the enterprise level site in this organization, and the lower project level site information. And you can see that even though the informations are different in the two of them, there is absolute clarity on making sure that the information within the child site, which is the project site in this instance, links up into the enterprise site, and that the information across the FAQs, the knowledge sharing, any templates, etc., is accessible. So they are clearly accessible between the two. But for this particular client, we made sure it was really clear. And this is back to level 1 maturity, generating awareness. And that's what we were trying to do with this. So having this helped provide a lot of clarity and decision making for management team around what they were going to see in each site. And it set that foundation quite beautifully from the outset. So that brings us to the very end of this presentation. This was something different to what I normally would do. Normally, I would be writing a blog or an article or something like that. Some things that are coming up that might be relevant for you if you are looking to, learn a little bit more about evolving your project management office. We do have a webinar that's coming up. To find out more, just reach out to the email on your screen. And also, in summary, sharing a little bit more about some of the work we've done. As I mentioned at the beginning, we do work across a number of different modules. Providing a service framework that is modular enables clients to pick and choose what they need help with at a particular point in time. We don't need to do everything at once. You might find that you are struggling with resourcing, or maybe you've got many different sources of financials and you can't make heads or tail of it. Maybe you're struggling with planning and delivery execution. Maybe you're having challenges around information and knowledge management. Ultimately, at Agile Management Office, our goal is to integrate and bridge the gaps between executive delivery and operations. And we do that by making sure that we are looking at ways to improve what you're doing at a point in time and help you to provide you that benchmark for where you need to go moving forward. We do that in collaboration with your teams, and we work together to deliver great outcomes. If you'd like to learn any more about anything I've discussed today, please reach out to the email that is on the previous slide. And we'd be happy to have a chat. Otherwise, get in touch with me on LinkedIn. Please follow us online, and you can also check out our podcast called Agile Ideas. Most recent podcast released this week. Looking forward to hearing further any feedback or questions you have about today's presentation. Was it helpful? Would you like to see further examples of some of the work that we've done? And if there's anything specific that you would like us to share, please reach out to me on LinkedIn. Thank you, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.